Good afternoon, everybody, to this event on the law and economics of Web 3.0. My name is Sergey Guriev. I'm a provost at Sciences Po, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this event organized together by Sciences Po, McCourt Institute, Georgetown University's Global Economic Challenges Network, and we have Francis Vela, professor at Georgetown, who is in charge of this network. I would also like to thank Sciences Po's chair on digital governance and sovereignty, and Florent Issel, who organized the conference tomorrow, and I would recommend highly to attend this conference tomorrow. Today, we'll talk about the problems that the new technologies, in particular social media, create for societies, economies, and political processes, and whether Web 3.0 can offer solutions or create additional problems. And we have a very distinguished panel with us. From my left, we have Brian Rich from Accenture, where he has the global AI practice for the public sector. We have Anupam Chander, who is a professor at Georgetown Law School. And we have Nate Persili, also a law professor at Stanford Law School. And on the screen on Zoom, we have Frances Haugen, who is an advocate for transparency and accountability of social media. You, of course, know Frances from her work on Facebook files, on whistleblowing, on Facebook's questionable practices of handling users' data and algorithms. I won't take much time. I'm Sergey Guriev. I also work on those issues, but mostly on Web 2.0, not 3.0. So I'm only here to ask questions rather than to provide answers. But I am, as an economist, as a political economist, I'm very worried about where we are. Basically, for people around who are mostly young people, you probably don't remember when Facebook was different. More than 10 years ago, Facebook didn't have a like button, didn't have algorithm. I actually remember a time when Facebook didn't exist even. But overall, what has happened in recent 10 years is something that a very important sociologist, Zeynep Tufekci, called us how social networks took us from Tahrir Square to Trump, where initially we thought that internet, social media are a liberation technology. And there are quite a few political scientists who wrote papers and books calling new social media, new internet technology, a tool for mobilizing protests, for holding power accountable, for increasing transparency. And then we discovered that social media is also a place where this business model, which maximizes attention and engagement, and therefore invests in making the services addictive, create also an environment where false news are disseminated quickly. So basically, the idea, as another important scholar, social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, called it, we have a dark psychology of social media, where basically social media want to maximize attention. And for that, they need to identify items which outrage you more, because this is what maximizes engagement. And so since truth is mostly boring and false news are mostly exciting, you create a natural system where false information is disseminated more easily. So I'm worried, and I think by this time I hope that you are scared and worried too. And the good news is we are here with the McCourt Institute, and the idea of McCourt Institute is not only to worry and scare us, but also to help us find solutions. And we at Sciences Po, as well as our partners in Georgetown and Stanford, have in our DNA, indeed, to design solutions for our societies. So with that, I'm moving to our speakers. Each of them will make introductory remarks of 5 or so minutes, and we'll start with Brian. Brian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you to you, Sergey, and Georgetown and the McCourt Institute. It's great to be here. So I work in the public sector and AI space for Accenture globally, and a lot of what we do deals with helping governments and institutions deal with disinformation, misinformation. I think it's not often considered how much money is spent by governments and public sector's institution to help manage and understand the source and nature and scope of disinformation that is being primarily amplified through social media. And we've been through three kind of very interesting waves of disinformation in the last 5 years, starting with the elections and election interference in the U.S. And I think we're still experiencing kind of the consequences of that initial attack on the information system in the U.S. And then pandemic and disinformation about the pandemic and COVID-19, and then the wave of disinformation around the vaccination and the anti-vax movement, which was primarily amplified through social media and disinformation, and spills over into traditional media. And then most recently, Ukraine. We're seeing a very interesting kind of emergence of deepfake information that's being amplified, and kind of this market of conspiracy theory that emerges. And so when we think of Web 3.0 from a public sector standpoint, I think the nexus with law and technology law is really around the authentication, the governance, and the resilience of information within a society, when you think about it from a macro perspective. But then there's also our dependence on technology companies, which have done amazing things to transform society in positive ways. But over time, as we move from analog to digital societies, Web3 really presents kind of a unique opportunity to disintermediate technology companies and potentially shift governance paradigms back towards citizens and society in ways that I think are important to the transformation, how this kind of Web3, the role Web3 plays in emerging society. With that, I'll pass it to
Thank you. Thanks very much, Sergey. It's a delight to be here. So the question I want to try to answer is, propose to all of you is, how do we do big things? So Web 1.0 was one effort to do this. This was to connect the world. The ambition was incredible. It came out of essentially France, if you actually want to think about it, because Tim Berners-Lee was working in a particle physics laboratory, literally in France, outside Geneva, at CERN. And so Tim Berners-Lee, of course, is not a French, but an Englishman. But his idea, Web 1.0, was to allow individuals to share information. So everyone would kind of homebrew their own computer as a server and connect it to network to the whole world. A brilliant concept, and he offered it for free. So it was totally not proprietary. So this was one of the keys to its success, because alternatives, including one for the University of Minnesota, basically said, hey, we may, right now it's free, but we may charge a licensing fee in the future. So this wasn't the only way to connect information. Everyone was working on this interconnection problem at the time. So that's what Web 1.0, where everyone kind of puts up their own blog online, they create their own websites. Even then, of course, there is huge centralization. So there was never a moment of entirely decentralized internet, because very quickly you saw America Online and other companies that offered much easier pathways to be on the internet. And America Online was originally a walled garden. So essentially, the folks at AOL determined what you saw on the internet. The internet was as defined by AOL in the United States. And obviously, all this, I should also say there's the Minitel, which is also occurring, which predates, much of the story I'm going to tell here. So the folks here in France will be well aware of the Minitel story as an alternative history. And there, that kind of government, how do we do big things? We do it from the governmental side. The government tells us, so there's one company working with the government that tells us what the global computer network looks like. That obviously couldn't meet the challenge of the internet of Web 1.0, which offered a much greater diversity and riches of information than Minitel did. So that's Web 1.0. And then you move to Web 2.0, which is kind of the rise of these platforms that help consolidate power, but also really make things much easier for us. So just think about the years in which these companies are founded. Amazon 1994, Google 1998, Facebook 2004, Twitter 2006, Spotify, the one European company that you might possibly place in this, also 2006. And so GAFAM is really kind of, except for Microsoft, which is 1975, a product of the late 1990s and early 2000s. And so then now the concern, of course, is the great centralization that is offered. Now, why did Web 2.0 beat Web 1.0? Well, it was because it was so much easier to turn to Facebook to share your information, so much easier to turn to Twitter to share information than to share your information on by your homebrew server. So the ease of access to the world that these platforms offered was difficult to rival by Web 1.0 systems. This brings us, of course, to the question of Web 3.0. And so the possibility, and here, what exactly Web 3.0 is still yet to be defined. And so you've got a vision coming out of kind of the Ethereum world of an Ethereum-based blockchain that's going to allow for individuals to create digital assets, to create digital assets that are they don't rely upon a single system to determine who has to whom that asset belongs. So these distributed ledger systems. And the alternate version, which is a kind of Tim Berners-Lee distributed web, which is based on another protocol. So the question here is whether protocols can replace the centralized entities in the internet. This is something that's being tested with Mastodon as an alternative to Twitter. And we've seen some of the advantages and disadvantages of that framework. I actually couldn't log into my Mastodon instance from the hotel, and I had lots of conversations with the person who runs my Mastodon instance about it, and he concludes that it's probably the hotel that's blocking it somehow, and that there are workarounds for that. So anyway, this is all very complicated, and so we'll see exactly how this evolves. But the critical thing is, for the young people in the room, is that all this has changed very fast. It changed exactly during your lifetimes, and it may change radically during your lives yet. And you have the opportunity to shape this future.
Thank you. Nate.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pick up a little bit where Anupam left off, which is to say that I'm going to talk not just about changes over the long term. I'm going to talk about changes just in the last year, and for the most part in the last 3 months. Because when folks like Sergey talk about the dark side of the internet, and I tell my students, look, I can't tell you that there's light at the end of the tunnel, but I can tell you there's going to be a lot more tunnels. And that's sort of where we are. And so I'm going to talk about the industry, what's happening in the industry from my standpoint in Silicon Valley, what's happening in the technology, and then what's happening in the policy spheres. And so think of this as just teeing up a set of issues for discussion. So first, the most significant, sort of at least attention-grabbing headline of what's happening in the industry is, of course, what's happening at Twitter, where we're watching someone learn the last 15 years of content moderation in the space of 3 months or so. And so how Elon Musk, how the industry responds to the way that he is thinking about content moderation or learning about content moderation and sort of doing it by fiat is, I think, going to be quite important for the way the platforms are going to be behaving in the next sort of the next year or two. And I think the jury is out as to what is going to happen at Twitter. I think that if you talk to some of the business people in Silicon Valley, many of whom have been rooting for him, that they think, look what he's done for SpaceX and Tesla, he could maybe turn Twitter around. If you talk to the advertisers out there, they of course have real concerns about the direction that Twitter is going. We will learn, I think, in short order in the next 6 months which direction this is going. As my colleague Alex Stamos in the Cyber Policy Center, which I run at Stanford, has pointed out, the other thing that I think is very interesting and that we need to be concerned about with respect to Twitter is not just this kind of content moderation by TikTok idea, but also how someone who has so many interests in authoritarian regimes, particularly Tesla's interest and dependence on China, will then have an effect on the way that content moderation is done and that the platform is run. Second, and somewhat related, looking at Apple, where Apple has now become the de facto regulator of the internet. Because of the effect that the App Store has on the way that the large platforms perform, Elon Musk realized this and has now been sort of using his Twitter feed to go after Apple and the 30% share that they're taking out of business done to their platform. Really, I think, quite important. And Apple has been, in many ways, the biggest force in change of policies at Facebook because of concerns about privacy and new rules that the App Store has with privacy. Interestingly, it's just in the last few days that Apple, I'd say in response to some of Musk's rantings, has said that that they are going to begin doing advertising again on Twitter. And so part of this kind of dialectical relationship between those two firms, I think, is something that's important to watch. Third, on Facebook, I think Facebook is on the ropes in many ways. And so while I think when the model that people have in thinking about the problems online right now is really dependent on Facebook, but Facebook has lost 2/3 of its value in the last year and a half. And so what's happening, if you talk to people inside Facebook, I think there's real concern that Zuckerberg is betting on the metaverse and there's real uncertainty as to whether the metaverse is going to pay off, certainly in the short term, but maybe even in the long term. Last, I just want to say that the beneficiary of a lot of this chaos in Silicon Valley has been TikTok, and TikTok is so understudied in part because there's so little transparency, but it poses a whole host of questions, particularly as relates to kids and who are the primary users of it, at least in the United States, as well as how a Chinese firm is then going to operate outside of China. Second set of points, I want to talk about the technology. We'll talk a little bit about Web3. So first, I was mentioning the metaverse, but I think part of the big question here is Facebook building something that it's actually not going to be able to take advantage of when it's business, when it would be relevant to its business. I can tell you there are people inside the firm who certainly are worried about that. Secondly, and this is just really in the last 2 weeks, because I've become infatuated looking at people who are putting up essays on GPT-3 and all of that. And so we can talk about AI generally, and I think AI is, you'll excuse the expression, almost a meta technology. To talk about AI is almost not an intelligible thing to say, but GPT-3 and DALL-E and the sort of auto generation of creative expression, I think, is something that we haven't come to grips with. I know I, as a professor, don't know what I'm going to do when my students start writing essays that are essentially generated by machine. Last, to talk about blockchain. And so I was reading at Stanford, particularly from law school, we have particular sensitivities to what's happening in the crypto markets right now. I'll say that FTX is not all of crypto. Crypto is not all of blockchain, and blockchain is not all of Web3, right? So that you can think about each one of these things in at different levels of generality. I mean, certainly the crypto folks are worried that FTX's collapse is giving crypto a bad name. Of course, the other cryptocurrencies have gone through the floor also. But I do worry that some of, those of us who are interested in the future of blockchain and these decentralized technologies, that the experience with crypto is certainly casting some serious shade on those innovations. I think that with the McCourt Institute and all of us who are working on these areas, that the way to approach these questions of how Web3 and particularly blockchain technologies are going to affect these problems is to not think about it as blockchain is the solution. Because in many ways, blockchain addresses one problem, the centralization of the web and the platforms. And maybe it can also help on the sort of advertising and privacy side, but it can also make some other problems much worse. And so as much as you might, we might diss on the platforms for how they deal with content moderation, a distributed environment in which any kind of bad actor can also have their own instance is, I think, something to be really concerned about. And so as we think about governance of Web3, I think we need to think about, the question I always ask when people talk about a new technology is how are people who try to exploit children and Nazis going to use it, right? And as we think about that, was that Francis? Yeah. And so we need to really focus on the governance of Web3 in order to address these problems. Lastly, let me just talk about the policy environment, particularly in Europe and in the US. So as all of you know, and we'll talk about actually next month here at CSPO, the DSA is the greatest experimentation in regulation, I think, that we've seen in a long time. And how the DSA will be implemented, particularly as it relates to transparency and algorithmic regulation, is going to set the standard for the world. And so how, and it's going to take a long time, I think, for us to figure out precisely how to implement those standards. And it's really quite important. It's also quite important for a piece of legislation that I've been pushing called the Platform Accountability and Transparency Act in the US, which will be introduced this week, I hope, and which is all about transparency with these platforms, both for researcher data access, but also public disclosures. And so that's my sort of 5 minutes from my perch in Silicon Valley.
Thank you very much, Nate. Let me try to, yeah, it works. Thank you very much, Nate. Before going to Francis, can I just ask people around the room to raise your hands if you have an account on Mastodon? There are people who have accounts on Mastodon.
I can't figure out how to use it though.
Can I just ask this question for you? To what extent you think the problem that Nate has indicated, do you think they're addressable on the current Mastodon? Or they're actually getting worse by the existence of Mastodon with multiple instances which are regulated, moderated in a decentralized way? I don't know. You need to take this mic. Sorry.
So it depends on what we think the problem is. If the problem is Jack Dorsey or Elon Musk making the call about what goes up and what comes down, then clearly that's not the problem of Mastodon, because there is no single czar of Mastodon. But if the problem is disinformation or other negative things, well, that depends.
Nazis and people who exploit children.
Nazis and people who exploit children, which is a wonderful way, really important way to frame this question. So Mastodon by design does not have virality features built in. It doesn't have an algorithmic amplification system. It doesn't really show how many times something's been retweeted or or whatever it is. Sorry, tweeted. The language of Mastodon is really nerdy and really awful. So
it was written by Dr. Seuss.
Okay, yeah. And so I think that yes, it will act. If everyone were on Mastodon, they'd be the bad things wouldn't go viral as fast, but the good things wouldn't go viral as fast either. And so there's good. So it just depends. So looking from the perspective of bad actors, the Nazis would still exist, right? Because the Nazis could find their own instance, and those that wanted to integrate with them, could, and et cetera. So this is the content moderation on Mastodon is done by community volunteers. The instances choose essentially, there are some very minimal global rules. How that's enforced is an open question. Just having rules doesn't mean they're magically enforced, as we lawyers know. So I would just say it's part of the story. I'm very glad to see Mastodon out there, and I hope it's successful. I'm not sure it's going to solve the issues.
Thank you very much, Anupam. So let's move to Francis. Francis, what do you think? What Web 3.0 can do for us, and will it create solutions or problems for both?
I thought the way the previous speaker opened his comments of saying the real question here is, how do you frame the problem? Like, what do you believe is the core of the problem? And one of the things that concerns me is we have not dissected enough sufficiently, or like there's not general enough consensus on what caused the centralized platforms to have problems for us to really understand, will Web3 address those concerns? So for example, even in the opening statement where there was discussion around how platforms like Facebook intentionally didn't fix their algorithms because being enraged keeps you there longer. You know, being enraged doesn't keep you there longer. Like they've done experiments where they, remove integrity features so that you see a more toxic, more angry, more violent potentially home feed, and you use it less. The problem was that what they did find was that when you optimized for engagement, when you optimized and said, hey, content which people click on, they give more likes, they give more comments, when we consider that content to be better, the network as a whole thrives because content creators, enough of them only create for that positive reinforcement that we need people to feed the engine of engagement to encourage the creators to keep creating. And it's fascinating because, there's a white paper from 2018 that, Mark Zuckerberg, I'm guessing someone else wrote this, but it has his name on it. There's a 5,000 word white paper that's still up on the internet saying, hey, we know engagement-based ranking is dangerous because people are inadvertently drawn to extreme content. It's the back of our brains scanning for threats. And that, no matter where we set the line for problematic content, people will engage right up to that line. And so there's this question, which is, let's unpack that one level deeper. So a core part of that problem is AI. When we have systems where computers direct our attention instead of other humans, that those systems will always have biases. And the question is, are enough diverse eyes looking at the outcomes of those algorithms for us to spot what those biases are? A huge part of why I support PATA, and Nate, every time I see you, I get excited because a little bit closer to transparency. The only way we can get enough people watching these algorithms for us to be able to spot critical imbalances, for us to be able to put pressure on these companies, either through boycotts, through investor divestment, through people outside offices, is if we can see what's going on. And one of the things that concerns me a lot about the rise of Web3 is I think almost certainly most Web3 social networks are going to be end-to-end encrypted. Like one of the selling points is this network is safe, it's owned by the community, it's moderated by the community, your communications are yours. And one of the challenges there is it becomes a thing of like, how do we then spot check those algorithms? Because even the companies that are running, or the organizations, they don't have to be companies, they can be networks of people who are running these systems. In an end-to-end encrypted world, we won't get to inspect the biases of the algorithms. And so it becomes this question of, what can we learn now from the centralized platforms while we can still see the content about design principles and figuring out kind of like what is the physics of these spaces, so that when we move towards decentralized platforms, we can understand like what are no-go features. So in the case of Mastodon, you were saying before, like things that are good are also not going to go viral as fast. I think there's questions there around, in a world where there can't be, human checks on where the machine is directing our attention, maybe that's just the thing we have to accept, that we have to design spaces that are intrinsically safer, even if we have to give up some of that sticky virality. And one of the things that we have to talk about is how do we force companies to do that or force organizations to comply that way? Because remember, people like algorithms. People like TikTok because it's so hyper optimized, because it's so hyper personalized. And so it's one of these things where we got here because the market produced these products. You know, these are natural equilibrium states of unobserved systems optimizing for market forces. If we assume we can just have decentralization and that those problems will be solved, I don't think that's true. And then the last thing in closing, I do totally agree with the comments made earlier about Elon Musk in China. You know, Elon will not say anything negative about China. And I think the fact that now two of the three major social media companies, or let's say there's 5 major social media companies in the United States, like Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, Reddit, YouTube. You know, the idea that 2 of those, TikTok and Reddit and Twitter, now are in a position where if there were to be a conflict between China and Taiwan, would anything pro-Taiwanese be distributed? Would there become issues involving, you know, like an information war front in the United States? You know, there's these questions where we're really starting to have national security issues in terms of having foreign actors having so much influence over our social media environment. And that's something that I don't think there's been enough conversation on. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Frances. You mentioned something which really scares me, which is the symbiosis of AI companies and Chinese government. There are a few papers in economics now that look at the business of private sector working in AI and procurement from Chinese government, local police.
Totally.
And basically, when you think about the history of 20th century, Soviet Union lost technological race. Because normally, if you're a non-democratic society, it's much harder to provide incentives for decentralized competition, innovation, and so on. But AI is a different technology. AI also demands innovation, creativity, but AI also demands huge data sets. And exactly because of the regulation NATO was talking about, in democratic countries, we protect privacy. In China, government collects a lot of data and gives it to AI companies to train their algorithm for face recognition. Now, the symbiosis that private sector companies are excited about this because they train their algorithms to use it for private applications. So they do for-profit business. And so this thing may reinforce each other to the extent that regimes like Chinese ones, it's now just one regime, may get ahead in this technological race and actually win the race against their Western competitors. So this is something that should really scare us. And whenever I ask people why we shouldn't be scared of this, they usually say it's an empirical question. Maybe creativity still matters in AI, and I agree with that. But there is a powerful force in there which totally consistent with what you just said. One thing you mentioned was economic incentives, and this is where I would go back to Brian now, because why do companies want to be transparent? Why would people like Ney want to spend their time on checking their algorithms? And as an economist, I can mention to you that we have examples like auditing accounts. Brian works in a company called Accenture. People around the table were born after Accenture was renamed from Andersen Consulting. Now, Andersen Consulting was part of Arthur Andersen, which itself disappeared. It was one of the biggest auditing firms that disappeared after Enron scandal, which was when people around the people in the audience were born, because the auditor didn't do their job well. But overall, in current system, you have this institution where companies open their account to professional gatekeepers. And in principle, both have incentives. Auditors have incentives to do their business and maintain their reputation. And companies have incentives to become transparent towards those professional institutions because they want to list in the stock market and because government requires their accounts to be audited. So there are solutions out there. And maybe these solutions are also applicable to the Web 2.0, 3.0. Brian, what do you think? Do we have business models that can defend us?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think there's a transatlantic agreement in terms of, kind of the importance of transparency and accountability in AI. But there's also this very strong reality that to have AI have a significantly favorable impact on an institution, you need to collect data, you need to access the data in order to build accurate models. So the challenge for the public sector, especially for federal agencies, whether it's in the US or Europe, is this transparency around the data and the data models is very important. And there's an emerging there's a market actually around the auditability of data and data models. And it extends to the fact that in many contexts, you cannot build models from information that's been scraped from the web because people are not aware that that information is being used by governments to build models, even if it's for things like climate risk assessment or flood risk or things that you would normally consider favorable, food security. And so I think there's going to be an emerging requirement and I think regulation around this because otherwise the digital divide is going to emerge where we are so dependent on corporations for these models, whether they're transparent and accountable or not, that from a society perspective, we really have to consider how do we regulate the access and transparency to data. The accountability from Accenture's standpoint is if we build an AI solution, it has to have a business impact, right? There has to be precision and accuracy. It has to work as advertised. The data that we use has to be vetted and transparently available. The models that we build have to be available so that they can be vetted. With commercial corporations, it's more of a black box. And you can see numerous indications of major corporations who brag about the fact that they have massive amounts of data that they've been scraping from the web. And in some cases, that has a very benign impact. They could be doing the same thing, food security or energy security or supply chain. These are all things that are very important applications. But where I think Web3 starts to become strategic in the public sector is around the preservation of data, because there's many situations where the first and only information to emerge on criminal activity in, let's say, Ukraine, human rights abuse, or crimes against humanity. That information, a lot of the evidence is gathered and stored on social media. So who's responsible for authenticating it, two, preserving it, and three, putting it in a state that it can be exploited later on as part of a workflow around criminal prosecution. And so I think governments are in a very unique situation because they have a responsibility, I think, to figure out how to use AI favorably for citizen experience and services. And I think Web3 provides this kind of strategic next dimension to that, where if they do it, if it's done well, and if there's regulatory frameworks, it will decrease the dependency on private sector to play the role of managing and preserving and authenticating government for citizens. So again, I don't think there's big answers, but there's still big questions.
Francis, did you want to jump in? It looked like you had your hand up, but I don't. Oh, okay. You're muted. But
one thing I would say is that auditing is I am in the last maybe 6 months, I have become like incredibly attuned to the liabilities we as a society have introduced by not auditing the metrics that tech companies promote. So like the situation with Twitter and like Elon Musk like making this brouhaha about how like they lied about their bots and you should be able to pull out. Like that was probably because he didn't want to pay for it. But the issue of things like they do report metrics, every big tech company, every advertising supported big tech company, or even ones that are subscription based, report how many users they have every month. And that means for the ones that are advertising based, they have an active disincentive from removing fake accounts. And I think one of the largest threats to our information environment is actually robotic amplification, like networks of inauthentic actors. And so this question of how are you going to establish traditions and standards and legal frameworks around auditing the new metrics of our economy is something we have to be talking about sooner rather than later.
And I think that a lot of work, and we're doing some of this at Stanford, but also in the kind of ecosystem on thinking about what these tech audits look like, I think is really quite important. I'll say one of the differences as we think about transparency in the tech sector as compared to the financial sector is that for the most part, when you're talking about transparency in the financial sector, it's much easier to define what you're talking about, which is basically the flow of money in the system. Whereas when you're talking about it, transparency in social media or in tech generally, right? There are huge trade-offs, right? So there are trade-offs with respect to privacy, which I've, having worked on an attempt at a transparency regime for Facebook for 5-6 years, we really confronted. And so there's no way that we're going to say that, Facebook should be completely open. So that your private messages would be revealed to outside researchers or the government. And then second, related to that is the risk of surveillance, right? And so that you don't want transparency to then facilitate other kinds of bad behavior. And the third thing I would say is gamesmanship, right? So that the more that you're transparent about, say, the algorithms or about content moderation, the more that the bad actors get in terms of trying to figure out how to game the system. And so what one of the tasks in writing this transparency legislation is to say sort of transparency toward one end. And so the types of transparency that are mandated include sort of widely viewed content, advertising, and algorithms. But even that, those are pretty big buckets, and it's the devil will be in the details as to how we sort of force on these platforms transparency.
Thanks. When we ask questions, who is going to do this and to what end? Web3 enthusiasts usually say community. Blockchain will solve that. And honestly, as an economist, I'm worried about incentives of people working on blockchain. They are not necessarily indeed motivated by the willingness to establish the truth. But then Wikipedia exists, and every economist can tell you that Wikipedia should not exist. But it does, and it works, and it's a wonderful phenomenon. And so maybe blockchain will miraculously solve our problems as well. To what extent you believe in this? To what extent you think that communities like in Mastodon, for example, will solve all these problems, and at least some islands, some instances in Mastodon will actually work well, sufficiently well to address those issues?
Well, I take Sam, I'll pass it over to you. So yes, there will be a Wikipedia on Mastodon or on the blockchain. And then the question is, well, what about the Nazis and the child molesters, right? Well, they're going to have their instance as well. And so that's the difficulty, is that sure, there'll be rosy pictures that we can see, but then how do you control the bad actors? And especially since the sort of name of the game with decentralization is to devolve power down to the community. Well, it's many communities. Some of them have best interests at heart of society, and some that are out there for spamming and scamming, as well as these more harmful communities. And so there's nothing about decentralization. Blockchain is a technology. There's nothing about decentralization that solves these problems, except that if you're worried about centralized power, and there are reasons to be worried about that from a competition antitrust perspective, that it does potentially address that. But a lot of these other concerns, and I want to amplify something that Francis said, which is totally right, which is one of the reasons we need greater transparency of these the current platforms is that we sort of need to study Facebook before it's irrelevant. Because once we move to a greater encrypted messaging or blockchain technology, it's not clear that we're going to be able to study them the same way.
Well, one of the things which I know from economics is when companies go bankrupt, you suddenly have access to all the accounts. And a lot of things have been studied exactly because companies like Enron were completely bankrupt, so you got access to all the records. Yeah, Brian, you want to respond?
Yeah, first of all, I do remember Facebook when it was nice. But I think it gets to the core of what happened with Facebook is that the advertising paradigm replaced what was initially a very organic and community-driven social network. And I think the complexity is there needs to be an economic model that rewards accuracy, and where information that's better than other forms of information. There has to be a business model that rewards accuracy, not just attention. And I think that it's difficult in social media because of the form versus a news article where you can actually read and look at the sources and you have named entities and facts and information. I think there is a way in social media to create maybe a tokenized model where accuracy can rise to the top, or information that has more sources than other sources of information, or the references within the information can be used not necessarily as a decentralized way to moderate, but there are basic ingredients that signal that this information has more sources than other forms of information. And this isn't new. This is like back to basics. I mean, this is why newspapers became authoritative. And what is complicated about social networks is a lot of the information that is emerging, that emerges organically from any given event is good information. It's a frustration that's being communicated, and facts and information that is not being covered elsewhere is being omitted from these networks. But I think where it gets, when we've had to deal with this, was Francis's point, there are orchestrated attacks on groups, individuals, societies, ideas, science, that are very, very expensive to counter and very complicated. Like the average government or individual does not have the resources to counter a massive robotic amplification of misinformation against them. And I feel like there is a dimension to this problem which is about regulation and is about regulating platforms, not because we're against free speech, but because you want the quality of the information to be distributed to be somewhat known. And I think transparency is a huge part of that. And I think AI can help to a certain degree identify information that's better than others. I mean, we've seen governments have to identify, especially with the rise of ISIS videos, for example. The content moderation became very efficient because of the traumatic effect of individuals having to watch those videos. They trained machines to do that, so humans weren't subjected to that level of violence. I think there are technology solutions to some of this, but I think there really needs to be an evolution in the legal framework around it.
So just to the question, can blockchain solve this? Can it can fix these problems? As Francis said, it depends on exactly on the problems. But I also want to say that blockchain introduces various problems, and that we should be mindful of as well. Blockchain is impossible to understand. It requires a level of mathematical knowledge that exceeds my grasp. And I've spent a lot of time trying to understand blockchain. And so what that means essentially is that we outsource the management and the understanding to someone else. Okay. Whereas I can understand how to roll my own server, I can't understand how to do proof of stake or any of those processes for blockchain. So ultimately, I'm relying upon someone else to do this for me. So blockchain has created lots and lots of intermediaries. And it turns out, if we follow blockchain's history thus far, that it's littered with corpses of companies that were not reliable intermediaries. And so the FTX example, where we were told, this was for the good of the world, he's making money, he's becoming a billionaire so he can give 99% of it away, etc. He was giving away money hand over fist to newspapers, to NGOs, to lots and lots of things that were very excited about the prospect of getting free money. I think that should make us a little bit, skeptical of some of the easy embrace of this new magic wand of tech solutions. So I want to be cautious about this. I think there are possibilities, but I think we should. Brian has been again. He's actually talking about law more than anyone else, even Nate on this panel. And I think
There's a legal.
I think that we make sure that lawyers and law is very much present in all these systems.
Can I follow up on this? So I think Brian says we need to create a business model where truth is rewarded, rises up to the top. And at some point you mentioned regulation, so you need to change the rules of the game. So indeed, bad stuff goes down and good stuff goes up. I'll give you an example. Today in Facebook, I think it started after 2016, the interference in social media. I fully agree with you that we learn how cheap it is to attack and how expensive it is to defend. But basically what Facebook did, they did something like what you just recommended. They used AI to identify bad stuff. Then they actually recruit humans, real fact checkers, certified fact checkers to check what is suggested as a suspect content. And in principle, that's exactly what we recommended. And we still are unhappy with Facebook. And Zuckerberg wants to do metaverse. Metaverse doesn't seem to work. So we've not solved this problem so far. So what is wrong with this model? What do you think? Oh, Francis knows. Yeah, Francis, go ahead.
But I think like when we talk about third-party fact checking failed, like I recently had to go and like try to look up statistics on like how many articles get fact checked a month. So one of the things that drives me crazy about Facebook on a regular basis is they do a lot of performative actions without giving us evidence of the substance of those actions. That's things like all their random interventions for eating disorders and self-harm and those things, which get shown to very, very, very few people. When it comes to third-party fact checking, at the height of the program in 2021, they were doing like 300 articles a week, right? Like with their top fact checkers, not a week, a month, 300 articles a month. And so it's one of these things where it's not a huge amount of volume. It's really, really meant to shave off just the very, very top of the head in terms of viral misinformation. And so I think one of the things that's interesting in terms of questions around like how can we make a business model of credibility? There are interesting alternative social media platforms. There's one right now that is in, I believe they have started their alpha, so I think I can talk about it, but I haven't been authorized to, so I won't name the name. Where they're looking at the idea of, should people acquire trust over time, kind of like with Reddit, like the more validation you get on Reddit, the more trusted you are. And should people be penalized for things like people calling in fact checks on them or having tiers of community reviewers? So, on things like Wikipedia, part of why they can be effective is that they have tiers of moderators who do different rounds of editing, and you can appeal up decisions to higher and higher tiers who have greater amounts of authority. And so I think there are opportunities where we can begin to have our algorithms have a concept of feedback loops, right? Like right now, our social media systems are not feedback loops in terms of information content, they're feedback loops in terms of engagement. And so adding in more dimensions on which people are evaluated, I think there are ways that you can scale those systems so that they are not like jobs, but in terms of like lots of different people are doing small amounts of contribution in terms of increasing the signal on information quality.
Can I just jump in on this? Because I think Francis is right that, and I think it's important to notice a little bit of the way she answered that question, which is to look at reputations of people as opposed to individual items. And that has to be the way that you think about this problem. So we have a series of studies that we did in conjunction with NYU, Josh Tucker's lab there, on crowdsourced fact checking, where we gave people every morning articles from a left-leaning publication, right-leaning publication, when it wasn't ideological, and the one that was like from a really bad source, according to NewsGuard ratings. And we gave it to 90 individual people and 6 professional fact checkers every day for about 4 months. All right, so we have a huge library of information on this. And while the fact checkers often disagree with each other, even to the extent that they were in consensus, people were really bad at doing fact checking in the day after a story broke. And that's what you have to think. These studies that look at people who believe in the moon, the Earth is flat, the moon landing never happened. Those aren't terribly interesting from a kind of practical perspective. But to what extent in the wild can you get at viral disinformation before it causes harm? And the problem is you just don't, and this is sort of the Hunter Biden laptop story a little bit as well as others, is that it's very hard in those 24 hours when it really makes a difference for the platforms to then make it. However, if you have a system built on the reputation of the users who are forwarding this, we do know that disinformation is a kind of 80-20 or 90-10 kind of problem, or even more than where you've got super spreaders of disinformation. And the question is, do the platforms want to go after those individuals? The problem from a political standpoint is that they are not, shall we say, politically random in the population as to who is most likely to engage in the promotion and distribution of disinformation. So if, for example, it happens to be that one political party has adherents who are more likely to spread disinformation, a moderation system that then goes after them is then going to run into political roadblocks.
Thank you. Francis, you wanted to add something?
No, I was just applauding going after super spreaders. One thing to remember is that basically all phenomena on social networks follow power laws. So it's like you were saying 80-20, it's more like 99-1, right? That if you do very, very small interventions, like you take the 99th percentile of people who reshare misinformation and you just slightly demote content that comes from them, because they're resharing not like twice as much as the median, but they're resharing 100 times as much as the median, you end up having huge declines in misinformation across the system. Like we're talking 30% declines by just down-regulating like a tiny, tiny fraction of the population.
So actually what you're saying is we can create a regulation where we demand social media companies to go after the worst perpetrators. But of course, the social media companies need to invest more in fact checking, because what you said, I think is really, really scary to what extent Facebook underinvests in fact checking. They spend millions of dollars, not tens of millions, even millions of dollars a year for this. And of course, that means that they check so few articles that their AI algorithms can train themselves. So this is largely ineffective. This is, as you said, performing arts business. Huh? It's not really fact checking business. So can we just impose saying you need to spend at least 1% of your revenue on this, or we can say you need to slow down dissemination from the worst users? Do you think that is something that should be done?
I think there's like, I think you're having rules that are based on scale. So like when you say something like 1% of your budget being devoted to fact checking, that's similar to things like states pass laws saying things like all public buildings must have a certain amount of their budget invested in art, right? Like there are things where we believe there are social goods and we can do proportionate burdens based on scale. I think the secondary thing though is we know that there are patterns to misinformation. So most of the conversation we've had so far today has focused on highly developed states, mostly democracies. When we look at developing countries that are facing ethnic violence, we see many patterns involving templated misinformation. So things like, imagine you see some story come across your feed and says, minority group A is putting substance in bicycle seats to make people infertile, right? Like that templating, like, minority group, some kind of neutral object, grocery bags, plastic on food, variety of things, the water, majority group. That templated misinformation is seen over and over again in places that have ethnic tensions. And one of the things that we saw at Facebook was that because they had such a heavy emphasis on defensibility, they struggled to even look at patterns of how information is constructed and generalize enforcement policies, so that third-party fact checkers would have to research every single one of those allegations, even though very clearly they are part of a consistent trend.
Can I just say that at least in the United States, were there a law that requires anything related to fact checking, it would be unconstitutional. If we're talking about disinformation, that is a no-go. We will see there's some very interesting cases that are going to the U.S. Supreme Court this year about liability of the companies as well as how the state's power to regulate them. But at least on the disinformation side, it's probably erring in the opposite direction.
Okay, can I ask you a question on this? So you have a right to say whatever you want, whether it's false or true, but as a private company, do I have to provide you a platform? Do I have to make your content the most distributed and disseminated content on my private platform? Why is that?
Well, when you say do you have to? The question is, can a law that forces you to restrict content can that be done consistent with the First Amendment in the U.S.? And the answer is no. Okay. You just can't because anything that is dependent on some metric of truth that the government is then going to impose on the platforms is going to be a no-go. There are other areas when you deal with harm, physical harm, where there might be greater latitude, but not when it comes to the truth of the information.
Right.
Nate, I have a question on that one. So in terms of like one of the things that I foresee happening with Gonzalez. So for context, for people who don't follow Supreme Court cases like a hawk, there is a case going to the Supreme Court basically asking, when Section 230 was written, we basically had bulletin board forms. Like there were almost no recommender systems anywhere in the world. Now that we live in a world where people are designing these promotion systems, where they actually have like a lot of control over what gets distributed, does it make sense to continue giving them just carte blanche immunity? Like I'm assuming one of the things that will happen if they do rule in favor of Gonzalez over YouTube is that it will cause so much chaos. It'll be so disastrous in terms of like opening the liability gates that we will pass a law saying companies that follow the following steps, which we consider responsible, are like maybe they get some kind of pass on immunity, or like there's going to be some kind of rewording in 230 to give some kind of safe harbor for certain kinds of actions. Nate, in a world where we had something like that, if the government isn't saying this is what is true, we're just saying like, hey, you have to establish a way, like some kind of system and make it transparent. Like, is that a thing that would still be unconstitutional? Like if you said you had to have content moderation systems of XYZ type?
That potentially could be constitutional, but I want to make sure people in the room understand that this case, and as Francis explained it, it's about harm, right? Because these were parents whose kids were killed in a terrorist incident, and the question is whether either YouTube hosting or recommending certain videos was sort of contributing to that kind of harm, which is very different than a generalized, lie detector on the internet kind of mandate. And so, yes, I think there are ways to get at the liability question if the platforms are essentially contributing to physical harm or offline harm. And I think the way Francis put it, which is that there could be a pathway to immunity that if you don't follow certain steps, that would be possible. Yeah.
Thanks.
So let me pick up on Gonzalez case because it involved Paris, of course. You recall the horrific past, I think it's 2015? 2015, right, in Paris. And many of you probably were here and experienced them. So my family was actually here at the time. And I was the one who called my wife and told her about the Paris event. We were at a restaurant at this exact moment in Paris. And I think here the question, the plaintiffs in the case say YouTube was responsible for the terrorism there. That is a pretty striking claim, but let's just try to understand then what that means. Essentially, it means that anytime there's harm and someone has said something on the interwebs, that harm is attributable to the company that allowed that to be said. And so that's a pretty remarkable leap of logic. And what it means essentially is that the interwebs suddenly become the most censored place in the world. Because now the companies say, hey, look, if we allow someone to say something, how do we know that that isn't going to lead to harm down the line? And voila, we will be held liable because our algorithms unintentionally, intentionally, whatever you say, promoted that content to the person who was then motivated to do X thing. By the way, the actual connection between the facts and the ground is just entirely speculation at this point. It's just very broad claims that ISIS terrorism, etc., was promoted on these services, which if you follow these things, the services are have long been, lots of people complain. In fact, they're in fact suppress a lot of speech that should be more critical of the West, etc. And so this means, if you're following the logic here, that if you criticize the West in some way and therefore radicalize someone, then you are possibly liable for allowing that criticism, then the company becomes liable for allowing that criticism on its site. that's a world where speech suddenly becomes very unfree. And so the Gonzalez case really holds huge implication for the ability to criticize the government, the ability to criticize authorities, the ability to criticize the West at large. So I think that's something, you guys know much more about this, the facts on the ground than we do, because I sat St. Lawrence, I said that my family was here, but this is something that we're thinking about, and how we want the rules that structure this, the liability rules, have direct impact on what is going to be allowed to be said online.
Thank you, Brian. and then-
Can I do one quick fact check though on that question of like what was ISIS doing? So to be real clear, like I don't think the Supreme Court should have taken this case. I think it's going to be a disaster no matter which way they rule. I agree with many things you say in terms of like it will introduce a slippery slope. But back when ISIS was growing, there was lots and lots of news coverage on ISIS was really interesting in terms of a terrorist group because they had cracked the social network formula. Like they had whole pipelines, they managed to like a marketing funnel. Like they were actively using these social platforms to find people, expose them, find ways to escalate them up a commitment chain to get them to do violent acts. And so I think part of the question here is like around when does culpability step in? Because like people warned platforms like YouTube that this was going on. And so I think I don't think the Supreme Court should have taken it, but we shouldn't say they saw some videos, maybe something happened. It's like a question of like when do you have a responsibility to step in when something like this is happening on your platform?
Thank you, Brian, and then we'll open to the
Sure.
audience.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Nate. It's going to be very difficult to, to legislate free speech in social networks. But I think what we can, an incremental step would be transparency about the information they're consuming. And this isn't new. I mean, food safety is a pretty good analogy. Or traffic safety. There just are laws governing. It doesn't mean you're against farming to demand that you list the ingredients in a product. And I think there are ways for tech companies they know a lot of information about the people that are posting information. Much more. If you're advertising with them, you actually have more information than the people consuming the information. That's why the micro-targeting is so asymmetrical in terms of the relationship between the source of the information and the consumer. So I think it's not a free speech question as much as what can we do to create more transparency so that when you're consuming information, you know that information comes from an account that was set up 6 hours ago, right? That the person has never posted before, that you know no information about them, and therefore you may not trust it. And so I think there may be ways to start to create, and we talked about it, tiers of how do you categorize the level of trust of a source of information. Not necessarily regulate its free speech unless it violates the policy of the platform. So I think there are steps that can be taken which don't necessarily contradict free speech.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for being so patient. We still have about 20 minutes for questions. If you have questions, please raise your hand. Okay. Okay, there is a question there.
Take the Q&A because we also have.
They have, okay.
Maybe
Okay.
you can start by them.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Let's give the mic to the gentleman there, and I'll read the questions.
Hi, it's working. Yeah. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was very enriching. There's a lot to say about all of this, and obviously not about all of it, but for any of us here. But as we look at this space, one of you many said, decentralization won't solve everything. It's new. It raises more questions and it offers solutions. The same can presumably be said with concurrency. Concurrency helps better understand what's going on, but it doesn't really solve any problem. Really first a good step. But I think in this specific space of information quality and disinformation, we spend a lot of time talking about manifestations of failure. There was a piece of bad information, there was a bad video, there was a bad tweet, there was a bad campaign, but we don't really have metrics or benchmarks for success. We talk about concurrency, we talk about tiers that usually work out, but we don't call out the elephant in the room, which is no system is perfect. So what level of imperfection are we willing to accept? And what constitutes a definition of success that we can then align for? As big states that someone who sometimes works with product engineering teams and what should I do? What's the answer here? And we don't really have that right now to give them. So I'm just here to get talking. Is there a metric? Is there a heuristic, which you think is the one that means success in this space?
wants to take this question?
Well, so let me say, you know, it depends which problem we're talking about as to what a successful, you know, response is. Let me say, first of all, I kind of think of transparency, if you'll excuse the expression, as kind of a meta law, right? Transparency is a prerequisite for everything else that we would want to do, both because it'll educate policymakers, but also if the platforms know that what they're doing is potentially going to be observed and known by outsiders, it will affect their behavior as well. Sometimes for better or for worse, we should be clear, right? There are certain things that happen behind closed doors where we should be concerned a little bit. You're talking about, like, say, anti-terrorism enforcement, that yeah, transparency might have there might be unintended consequences. But what would the metrics be? And the answer, I think, is almost that when you have transparency, we can develop a lot of metrics that we don't currently have. And to think about, you know, almost a market for metrics, but that the way we would think about applying something, say, to YouTube. I mean, I think to some extent this is an impossible question to answer because, you know, if it involves someone's life, right, no one's going to say that no matter what happened, it's like if 5 people died because of YouTube videos, we're not going to say that that's tolerable. And so it's different than, I think, food safety or drug safety in that way. But part of this is to get a sense of the trade-offs as to, you know, what can you do to protect free expression on the one hand, while ensuring safety on the other. And let me also say that it's not clear to me, you know, that transparency. There are 3 areas where people on the outside and the firms have diametrically expressed positions. One is the scale of the problems. So whether it's disinformation, hate speech, and the like, those on the outside tend to think that these are huge problems on the platforms. For the most part, if you talk to the folks at the platforms, it is a concentrated problem on a small share of users. Okay. The second is the role that algorithms are playing in recommending bad content, whatever bad content we're talking about. Those on the outside, with the exception of some social scientists that I think have been able to crack the code a little bit, those on the outside definitely say the algorithms are leading to these problems. Those on the inside say, no, the algorithm, you misunderstand how big a problem the algorithms are. And the third is about political bias inside the firms. To what extent are the content moderation systems and algorithms leading to certain speakers being favored over others in a kind of politically biased way? All of those questions are answerable through transparency. If you put me in the room, you know, and got me the data on those things, we could actually try to bridge that gap. But right now, we just don't have the answers.
So I'll say one thing, which is that the platforms kind of introduce FUD around these issues by using terminology like we reduced hate speech by 40% or something like that on our platform. That's an impossible calculation. They're pretending they have a denominator. And so because what exactly is in those categories is very much subject to the teams that are making those calls. Those calls can be made differently. We see the Facebook oversight board that makes different calls than the Facebook internal teams. And if there were oversight boards for the other institutions, you know, we see variations in the interpretation of community guidelines. This is what, you know, law professors will certainly tell you about how law works. There are various ways to look at how to interpret what the truth is. And so one of the questions here, and one of the reasons that US law at least is very averse to saying there is a truth out there, is because truth is very hard to determine. There's a kind of imagined ground truth that is well known or easily discoverable. But as the crowdsourced fact-checking example that Nate talked about, where people try to figure out what the truth is, and then the fact checkers disagree on what the truth is, and the community folks after investigation don't decide what the truth is. When judges are asked these questions, they take months and even years in the United States to come up for a decision in one case. And so these are hard questions. We don't have good answers. And I'm not sure there is a metric. So it may be that we moved into a world where there there are no obvious perfect solutions, and that's a complicated world to live in.
So now you know why lawyers get paid so much. It takes so much effort to establish the truth is, right? So.
I would argue the
I think
Yeah, Francis,
I think
go.
there's also, I think there's one of the other kind of implicit things in your question is there's just so much normative bias in terms of like when you say like, let's define good. Because like we can come in there and say things like Facebook did experiments where they said, you know, can we like someone who is able to speak to both sides of the aisle is someone who has thought more about how to communicate. Like that's a harder process than just doing something that like knee jerks one side or the other. And they were able to develop metrics for identifying those kinds of constructive conversational motifs. And they were able to model like, is this person able to speak to a broader set of people? And when you give a slight boost to content that comes from people like that, you do see reductions in things like misinformation and hate speech. I think there are interesting questions around things like, you know, we talk about this idea of in the first 24 hours, it's very difficult to figure out what is happening and what is real. And I think there's interesting things around modeling over time, people who are good at initial hunches, right? Like in a world where you said, hey, we have to figure out systems of governance that are more scalable. You know, if you are collecting data from like a large number of people on like, does this seem plausible? You can end up in a world where you can have a first draft of history where at least the craziest stuff gets dampered. But the problem is sometimes the world does change in unpredictable ways. Like in a world like that, would we have seen the rise of the Black Lives Matters movement as much as we did? Like people outside of the Black community, the idea that the police were being that violent was a foreign idea to them. And so in a world where we were more biased towards people who are in general better at first reads on things, we do face consequences from those trade-offs. So there are no perfect solutions, just ways of approximating better.
Can I just say something to agree with Francis on one point there, which is that while the average person the crowd doesn't do a great job of sussing out what's true and false, you can through machine learning get some valuable signal from the crowd. That I think is in some ways the hope with bird watching or whatever it's called, community notes now and some other these things. And so yeah, you can use the crowd in those kinds of ways. Yeah.
I also think we're seeing, corporate governance is an important part of this equation too, because I would argue the platforms have been very successful from a product engineering standpoint. So successful that we're here tonight talking about them. But I think that what happened on Twitter was very interesting, that they lost a massive amount of advertising revenue because the brands did not necessarily want to be associated with the rhetoric that would potentially emerge in a Twitter that was not enforcing the same level of content governance, right? And so I think there's going to be it's going to be a multi-dimensional solution. It's going to require new economic incentives, which you see in newspapers, like the best news stories, you see them shared the most. Potentially they're the most salacious in some cases, but if you look at which stories in the New York Times or Le Monde or Washington Post, they tend to be by journalists who've done really good investigative reporting. They have great sources. Not in all cases, but it's maybe not, everybody's a super nerd. But I think there are opportunities to create economic models that reward that the recommendations are based on the quality of the information and the fundamental using machine learning, for example, to come up with some indication of the quality of the information that's being shared. But I also think that corporate governance is going to be a big part of it. Like, it's advertising is such a huge part of the information economy that Mastodon, could thrive, in terms of pocketed communities of people, but it's not going to have the same societal impact that Twitter has for right or for wrong. And I even remember Glassnet in
Russia,
Moscow, right? At the very beginning when the wall came down, for example, with a massive amount of collaboration on how to address what's next in the new Russia and CIS. And that was all about trust and people communicating, and you could tell who you were talking to based on what was the content of that network where they came from. So I think social media is still a tremendously important part of the future of society, but we need to come up with ways that are, I think Francis mentioned, that scalable systems of governance
And the technology exists to help do that, but I think we do need frameworks to enforce the level of transparency and accountability required to get to the next level.
Thank you. We have 7 minutes remaining, and we have 4 questions on Zoom. Francis can see them. Brian, Anupam, and Nate can see them if they turn back. So I suggest that we do a round of speakers around the tables, and you pick your favorite question or two and answer. So the first question is about can we balance regulation of Web 3.0 with the need to keep economic dynamism, innovation, and so on. The second question is something related to this monopoly of Apple, but in this case, it's monopoly of data storage, which is Amazon, right? To what extent we should think about the Web 3.0 being decentralized? It's all stored on the one big company's cloud services. The third one is something that we kind of talked about. Can we marketize reputation and therefore create tokens of trust? And then the last question is by Leila, who is asking about the business model of Mastodon Web 3.0. Is Mastodon Web 3.0? What is Web 3? So I suggest we go in the opposite direction this time around. So we start with Francis. Please pick your favorite questions or just say something you want people to take away from this panel.
Sure. I think why don't we kind of touch on question 1 and 2. So I think one of the things that's going to be super interesting about the rise of decentralized platforms is depending on how you architect those decentralized platforms, there may be very little ability of governments to step in and enforce regulations on them. So I remember originally when I came out, like I kind of rolled my eyes when people talked about Web3 social networks, because I view social networks from a framework like a previous bias as someone who had worked on the algorithms of multiple social networks, that in my mind, part of what made social networks attractive was that recommendation power, right? That every time you open your phone, Facebook, Pinterest, wherever, looks at thousands and thousands, if not tens of thousands of pieces of content that you might like and picks out a handful to show you first. In a world where you, if you keep that as a prior, you say like, oh, that is a fundamental characteristic of a successful social network, I think we are going to see a continued reliance on some centralization. So, we talk about in the question too of like, if stuff's still on AWS, isn't that still centralized? If you want to be able to do that, have tens of thousands of items that are potentially loosely connected to you and have recommendations, I think it's going to be very hard to do that without having some centralized servers. And a lot of the pitches I've heard currently for doing decentralized social networks have a recurrent problem, which is the individual service providers have to copy the data off the blockchains in order to provide services like that. But if you give up that assumption, if you come in and say, no, we're going to do a true decentralized social network, we're going to do something maybe a little closer to Signal, or maybe even more decentralized than Signal, where I have my friends scattered around the world. There may be content that lives on a central server for a brief window, or maybe even decentralized server for a brief window of time until my friends actually get it on their devices. But most things are going to be more peer-to-peer directly. You could make a social network in that world where it's extremely decentralized, and that would also be an extremely hard to govern social network. It'd also be a very hard one to stop, because like as long as it's running peer-to-peer, maybe you can block it from app stores, but that's about it. But that world is also safer in that it's hard, like most of the problems in my view around misinformation are coming from a very small number of users who are very aggressively spreading misinformation, and or nation states who are doing these large scale automated networks. In a world where you have more, you have it be more about your family and friends, it's smaller scale, you can have a lot of social contact, a lot of community without having the same problems that affect virality. So, it might go hand in hand that if you really want to be outside the grasps of the ability to touch in and regulate, because you're using AWS, using other centralized large scale services, it might be that you might get forced down to a scale where you are more likely to be safe just by the limitations of what you're left with.
Thank you, Francis. Nate?
Since one mentioned my name, I'll just deal with this question about, whether Web3 do I consider Mastodon Web3, and then also what's the business model, and then also one thing about disinformation, which is to some extent Web3 is whatever you make out of it, right? It's defined because it's not Web2, as I guess the way to put it. And so I think that's why I focus on decentralization as opposed to whether it's 2 or 3 or 2.5 or 2.7. And so I think that to what extent are these technologies, blockchain is certainly the kind of standard against which Web3 is being judged, but it's not the only thing that we should be looking at. And so Mastodon, it was very interesting at this conference that Francis and I were at in Miami last week. There was a debate about this. And it's like, well, whether Mastodon was Web3 or not. And it's like, Mastodon's Mastodon. It has these decentralized characteristics, and it offers that kind of way of looking at the problem. And I'll say, picking up a little bit on what Francis was saying, I also think it's really important whenever you talk about these content problems to ask what I call the WhatsApp hypothetical, right? Because those of us in the US, WhatsApp is not used a whole lot in the US. Europe, it's used quite a bit, and certainly in the developing world, it's used a lot. And all of these problems that we see with respect to content moderation, hate speech, disinformation, and the like, especially when they're organized actors, state actors, like Francis was talking about, who are seeking to manipulate the social network, we see it, a hell of a lot. Whether it's Brazil, India, you pick
2018.
you pick the country. And remember, WhatsApp doesn't have an algorithm; it doesn't have advertising. Right. And so if you're going to focus on these kinds of problems with respect to content and virality, you got to deal with the WhatsApp hypothetical.
So.
Do you want to answer the very last question which came up during your intervention? If you want to pick up one thing to fix social media within 2 years, what would you pick? If you don't have a solution, it's okay. I think we already got your answer there. Transparency.
That's a simple answer.
None about.
And they literally stole my earlier answer, which was about the WhatsApp hypothetical as he described it. WhatsApp does not have an algorithm that promotes things. Instead, it's individuals sending to their individual networks. Right. So, and it's yet a huge problem across the world. So we have to figure out what is, so what that tells me is really there's not one single solution to this problem. There's not a simple way to say the algorithm's at fault. Or it's so what we also hear is it's advertising. If we only got rid of advertising, we would solve everything. And if we just made people pay, then the world would be much better. And all of that is a kind of magic wand solutionism to the realities of how complicated this terrain is. When you give people the power to speak with each other, unfiltered to a large extent, that opens up a Pandora's box for good and bad. All the good things Francis said about BLM and Me Too only occurred because of the internet and the virality that it offered. The ability to say this person in authority is actually has done something terrible. And that is something that the platforms offered, that it wasn't easy to put in the newspapers because the newspapers were worried about what liability. And so the exact kind of thing that wouldn't appear in the newspapers, this sexual harassment or abuse of Black people in the United States and across the world wasn't invented in this century or this millennium. This existed for a long time. And so, but we're hearing about it now because of these things. That's the good part. All the other bad stuff is also at the same time here. And I think we should be careful about that one. I'm going to defer to Francis.
Yeah,
I want to, given we talked about WhatsApp 2 speakers in a row, I want to just give like a tiny little tweak on that. So in the case of WhatsApp, I think it highlights the role of friction, right? So like one of the most important things that was done to radically reduce misinformation on WhatsApp was they said, hey, we're going to have a little piece of metadata travel with the message. So this is not a centrally controlled way of dealing with misinformation. This is a way that is actually included in the message. And if that gets reshared more than 5 times, people can still repeat it, but they have to copy and paste. When that same experiment was run on Facebook.com, but they said, hey, let's cut it at friends of friends. So misinformation, once it moves more than 2 hops down a reshare chain, let's say you can say whatever you want. You can speak truth to power, but you have to choose to. You can't just, reflexively hit reshare. That had the same impact on misinformation as the entire third-party fact-checking program. And remember, the third-party fact-checking is about blunting the most viral, most highly distributed misinformation. But it scales. And so in the case of WhatsApp, if WhatsApp implemented a standard where they said, hey, once it gets beyond friends of friends, you have to intentionally share this. It would, a lot of the conversations we have about the dangers of WhatsApp would radically go down. But it's one of these questions of WhatsApp doesn't want to admit that their products are dangerous. And so I think the real question becomes we know ways of making these products safer, but when we move into a decentralized space, we may lose the ability to have ways of pressuring the systems to adopt techniques like that.
Thank you. Thank you. Since we talk about Facebook and WhatsApp, let me remind you that in the recent history, we had a Facebook president and a WhatsApp president. And the Facebook president was an anti-corruption activist, Klaus Johannes, president of Romania, who won his campaign in the most corrupt country in Europe. Romania is officially the most corrupt country in the European Union. He won it on Facebook. So this is your liberation technology. But we also have a WhatsApp president, and that is Bolsonaro, who won his campaign in 2018 on WhatsApp exactly because of the features you mentioned. And one other feature, which we shouldn't forget, this is something that people in developing countries know. Sometimes Facebook gives you zero ranking plans, where you get Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, but you cannot go to fact-checking websites because that's the only internet you have. And with that, you can disseminate this information intentionally, which Bolsonaro's campaign did. And the users could not fact check because most Brazilians at that point would use zero ranking plans. This is the zero rating plans. So this is the reality, which is very different from the one we enjoy in Europe or the United States. So it's both good and bad. It's both liberation and disinformation technology. In Tianfu, we start things 5 minutes late. We try to finish on time. We are 5 minutes late still. So I would like to wrap up here. I would like to run a round of applause for our speakers because I learned a lot and I'm a bit more optimistic.